think there's no comparison. They would be the first commercial company, the first company to be sending astronauts into orbit ever on commercially owned, not only rocket, but also space capsule. The fact that they're doing this with NASA, as Michael just mentioned, has been years and billions of dollars into the works. So really, essentially, even though we have this scrub today and the launch is now being pushed to hopefully, potentially, weather and technical stuff permitting as soon as Saturday, you're still talking about history in the making right now. I would just say, as we're looking at these pictures of Launch Pad 39A, you've had those astronauts, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, on board for the better part of 2.5 hours. And this really did come down to the wire, less than 17 minutes, which is pretty unusual for NASA to wait that long to make a call. But in terms of things you can control versus things you can't, the weather is just one of those things you can't. And I think if this hadn't been an instantaneous launch window, meaning it had to happen right at 4:33 p.m. Eastern exactly, if they could have waited just maybe even another 10 minutes, the conditions could have potentially changed and we could have seen this happen. But as it stands, safety is first priority. Obviously, space is hard. You want to get everything right. You want to get everything as perfect as possible. So now we will set our clocks and await the next launch window, which will be Saturday afternoon at 3:22 p.m. Eastern.
Okay, got it. So obviously, Michael, it's huge for Elon Musk and for SpaceX. What about the United States? I mean, clearly this is of great importance historically and maybe geopolitically. I mean, the president is there. I think Air Force One had already touched down there. Is that right?
Sarah, yes, that's spot on. Air Force One had flown over the launch pad actually just before, about an hour and a half before this was scheduled to launch. But for NASA, the importance of this mission when it does launch, it cannot be understated. That we have spent almost a decade paying Russia upwards of $80 million per astronaut to fly on their spacecraft. Ever since the space shuttle program ended in 2011, we haven't had a way to get our own astronauts into space, even as we've maintained a presence on the International Space Station. So it's critical for NASA, especially in the terms of the agency's long-term goals, to be able to launch it regularly. But it's also a cost-saving mechanism as well. NASA sees paying SpaceX for services, essentially putting the astronauts on a spacecraft that SpaceX has built, as a way to save money over the long term, rather than building an entire spacecraft themselves as they have in the past.
And Morgan, I mean, to that point, to what Michael is just saying, does this all mean that SpaceX has far more clear routes to monetization than perhaps Virgin Galactic does, which is kind of more of a pure tourist play?
So Virgin Galactic is, as it currently stands, more of, I think, a pure tourist play right now. Obviously, longer term, you're talking about the potential for hypersonic travel, point-to-point travel via rocket around the world, which is something that NASA has actually recently partnered with them for too. But in terms of this and in terms of SpaceX, yes, what SpaceX has essentially developed here with Crew Dragon and this commercial crew program with NASA is a space taxi, if you will. So NASA goes from being a specialist in operations and owning its own hardware to now helping invest in and develop the hardware alongside SpaceX, but essentially becoming a customer, one of potentially many customers. And by the way, SpaceX is already partnering with other companies to potentially, as soon as next year, start sending some paying tourists up to the International Space Station and into orbit as well. There's even plans for a movie with Tom Cruise on the ISS in the coming years. So yes, there is a lot of opportunity, not only with NASA, but in terms of commercialization of space and low Earth orbit. And of course, it's bragging rights for SpaceX too, especially as it does look to develop a next generation Starship rocket and eventually make its way not only to the moon, but to Mars.